made more bountiful and abundant. TikTok literally is infinite. It never runs out. Made more novel. Dopamine is very sensitive to novelty. And not only are these drugs everywhere, they also chase us down. Like they'll show up in our inbox or they'll show up on our news feed, right? It's very hard to avoid them. The problem is that if we have a huge and sudden upward spike in dopamine release, it's too much for our brain to handle. By downregulating dopamine transmission, not just to baseline, but actually below baseline into this dopamine deficit state. And that's the come down, the hangover, the TikTok video, right? Digital drugs, this would be things like, intermittent fasting from digital media, taking a break from your phone.
PIVOT の竹下です。今日の PIVOT グローバルのテーマはドーパミン中毒です。ドーパミン、脳内麻薬と呼ぶ人もいますけど、本当私たちは快感を得る仕組みですよね。例えば美味しいものを食べるとか、仕事が好きな人は仕事をしているときとか、あるいはスマホを見ているとき、どんどん、脳内が興奮して、快感を覚えると。ただそれは実は危険なんだということを、スタンフォード大学医学部のですね、依存症の世界的権威のアンナ・レンブケ教授が言っています。では、そのアンナ・レンベケ教授に話を聞きます。あまりにも快感を得すぎると良くないということなので、あえてですね、ネガティブな効果を自分の脳に与えることで逆に快感を得られるという、ちょっと複雑だけれど面白い体の仕組みがわかると思いますので、早速教授に話を聞いてみたいと思います。Dr. Lembeke, welcome to Pivot, welcome to our show.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here.
I read your book, Dopamine Nation. It's really great. I highly recommend it to our audience because we are in the startup community and I think we're kind of addicted to work. I'm also kind of addicted to work, so it was very good. I want to start off by asking you what's the definition of dopamine?
Dopamine is a chemical that we make in our brain. It is a neurotransmitter. Neurotransmitters are the molecules that bridge that gap between neurons. Neurons send the electrical signals that make our circuits, that make us who we are. But neurons don't touch end to end. There's a little gap between them. And that gap is called a synapse.
Mm-hmm.
And neurotransmitters allow for fine-tuned modulation of those electrical circuits.
Mm.
So dopamine is a neurotransmitter. It has different functions, but one of the most important functions is that it's involved in the experience of pleasure, reward, and motivation. It's not the only neurotransmitter involved in that process, but it is probably the final common pathway for all reinforcing substances and behaviors.
It's interesting that there's kind of a feel-good line, and sometimes you go above the line, which you feel good, but sometimes you go below. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, sure. You said it really well. So we're always releasing dopamine at a kind of baseline tonic rate. It's kind of like the heartbeat of the brain. And when we ingest something that tastes good, or we do something that is new or novel or important to our survival, basically we increase dopamine firing above baseline, which again makes us feel good, which is the mechanism by which we are encouraged to do it again.
Mm-hmm.
And when you think of natural rewards like food, clothing, shelter, finding a mate, dopamine is essentially our survival neurotransmitter. It gets us to work really hard to get those things that we need for basic survival. The problem is that if we have a huge and sudden upward spike in dopamine release, it's too much for our brain to handle. So then the brain has to compensate or adapt by downregulating dopamine transmission, not just to baseline, but actually below baseline into this dopamine deficit state. And that's the come down, the hangover, the blue Monday, the craving, that moment of wanting to watch one more TikTok video, right? Before it goes back up to baseline firing.
So you mean, for instance, if you drink a can of soda or you have ice cream or ramen or you're on your phone, you kind of feel good, your dopamine goes up. But the consequence is that it goes not only to the baseline, but below the baseline.
Exactly. So we pay a price for these instant quick pleasures, especially if they don't require much upfront work. So if you think about the world that humans have lived in for most of our existence, it's been a world of scarcity and ever-present danger, where in order to find food, clothing, shelter, and a mate, we had to walk tens of kilometers every day. We had to withstand terrible cold. We had to go hungry. And so in that state of hunger and need and exhaustion, dopamine levels go down, we find our reward, and then it brings us back up to our baseline homeostatic position. But today, we can sit on the couch, swipe right or swipe left, and get this huge spike of dopamine. And that's way more than we really were evolved to manage. And so the result is that we're getting this kind of compensatory dopamine deficit state, or this come down.
So what's the difference between instant spike and like a constant spike? Because for instance, I like my job, and I like to because it's a startup, and I like changing the media landscape in Japan. But at the same time, I can understand that maybe when I'm on social media or eating ice cream, that's so instant. So what's the difference between instant spike and a constant spike, which might be good for our mental health?
Right. So, if you have that sudden increase in dopamine, which we get with intoxicants, which we get with sweet food, which we get with orgasm and sex, which we get with, all kinds of digital media, because digital media is very potent, goes right to our visual cortex, releases dopamine in the reward circuitry. You get that sudden upward deflection, right? Which does feel really good, but it's followed by a compensatory downward deflection, this dopamine deficit state, which feels really bad. And also importantly, sets up the state of craving, which has us wanting to do it again to get out of that dopamine pit and not only get back to baseline, but maybe even get above baseline again. So it's this cycle of intoxication, withdrawal, dopamine free fall, craving, drug seeking, intoxication, withdrawal, this kind of sine wave that is really what happens in addiction, and also what creates this kind of compulsive cycle where we ingest more of our drug or a behavior than we really want to, or than we really plan to. And it's difficult to stop, even when we want to.
So you talked about in your book some tips how to prevent that, and I like the analogy of gremlins. Could you explain to us what you mean by that?
Yeah, so to understand what happens as we go from adaptive, healthy use into maladaptive, compulsive, addictive use, it's really essential to understand that pleasure and pain are co-located in the brain and work like opposite sides of a balance. So imagine like a teeter-totter or a seesaw in a kid's playground, a beam on a central fulcrum. And that represents how we process pleasure and pain. We evolved over millions of years of evolution to reflexively approach pleasure and avoid pain as a way to survive in a world of scarcity. Now, there are certain rules governing this balance, and the first and most important rule is that the balance wants to remain level, such that with any deviation from neutrality, our brains are going to work really hard to restore a level balance. So again, if I eat some chocolate, that releases a little bit of dopamine in my reward pathway, my balance tilts to the side of pleasure. But no sooner has that happened than my brain will adapt to that increased dopamine by wanting to bring it level again. And I like to imagine that as these neuroadaptation gremlins hopping on the pain side of the balance to bring it level again. But the gremlins really like it on the balance. So they don't get off as soon as it's level. They stay on until my balance has tilted an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. And that, again, is the come down, the hangover, that craving for one more piece of chocolate. Now, if I don't have another piece of chocolate, the gremlins get the memo that their work is done. They hop off and balance or homeostasis is restored. But if I continue to consume chocolate over days to weeks to months to years, then essentially what happens is that initial deflection to pleasure gets weaker and shorter, but that after response to pain gets stronger and longer, Or another way to think about that is the gremlins start to multiply. And pretty soon I've got enough gremlins to fill this whole room, and they're camped out on the pain side of the balance. And now I've entered into addicted brain, right? Now I've changed my hedonic or joy set point such that I need more of my drug in more potent forms, not to get high and feel good, but just to level the balance and feel normal. And when I'm not using, I'm walking around with a balance tilted to the side of pain. I'm in a dopamine deficit state, experiencing the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance, which are anxiety, irritability, depression, insomnia, and craving.
So you're saying that it's like a seesaw, and if you have too much pleasure, the seesaw tilts, so that the gremlins will hop on the other side to keep the balance. So in your book, so is this what you're saying that so if you think backwards, in order to gain pleasure, you can like intentionally put pain on your body or your mental health. So in turn, the gremlins will hop on the other side to give pleasure to us.
Yeah, right. So
Yeah.
you intuited
Yeah.
exactly, sort of, well, what can we do about this?
Mhm.
And what we can do is we can avoid intoxicants. If we're going to use them in moderation, leaving enough time in between for the gremlins to hop off and for homeostasis to be restored. But the other thing that we can do is we can intentionally press on the pain side of the balance, for example, through exercise, through ice cold water immersion, through intermittent fasting, or other ascetic practices. And when we press on the pain side of the balance, those gremlins will hop over on the pleasure side of the balance, and we will get our dopamine indirectly by paying for it up front. And the big difference here is that, unlike with intoxicants, where we get that spike of dopamine followed by free fall into that dopamine deficit state, when we get our dopamine indirectly by doing things that are painful or difficult or hard, we see a gradual rise in dopamine over that period of exercise, for example. And then dopamine levels will remain elevated for hours after stopping exercise before going back down to the baseline tonic position. And we never go into that dopamine deficit state, which, remember, is the state that sets us up for the craving that drives that compulsive use. So it's a really nice way to get your dopamine because it's relatively immune to this problem of compulsive overconsumption, because you're not going into that dopamine deficit state. You're doing the work first. Having said that, I want to emphasize that some people actually can get addicted to things like exercise or things like fasting,
Right.
or some people cut on themselves, right, as a way to release endogenous opioids that releases dopamine. That's not good, right? That's too much or too extreme a version. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about right-sized pain, not too much, not too little, but just the right amount, such that we get that healthy dopamine, we restore balance in between, and we don't set up that loop of compulsive overconsumption.
Yeah, I think that was the most interesting part of your book. So you touched upon like practical tips such as fasting and maybe having a cold shower. Could you give us some advice or good examples how we should keep the good balance of pain?
Let me just emphasize that in the modern world, it's really difficult because almost every aspect of human life today has become drugified in some way, made more potent, right? Releases a lot of dopamine, made more accessible with our digital devices. We have 24/7 access, made more bountiful and abundant. TikTok literally is infinite. It never runs out. Made more novel. Dopamine is very sensitive to novelty. And not only are these drugs everywhere, and I include behaviors in when I use the word drugs, but they also chase us down. Like they'll show up in our inbox or they'll show up on our news feed, right? It's very hard to avoid them. So what we essentially need to do is, before we are actually tempted, we need to plan out what we're going to use, how much and how often. And we need to really intentionally insulate ourselves from the constant bombardment of pleasures, as well as intentionally seek out difficult, painful, or inconvenient ways of doing these things. And there are so many ways to do this, right? I mean, if we're talking about digital drugs, This would be things like, intermittent fasting from digital media, taking a break from your phone for a full 24-hour period.
I see.
24 hours is not enough to probably reset reward
It's not enough.
pathways.
Okay.
No, but it is enough. It is enough to sort of get the sense of just how addicted we've all become, right? And to begin to think about withdrawal that we experience and the ways in which our attention is almost always on some level occupied by our device, taking up brain space that we then therefore don't have for other things. It's enough time to recognize the ways in which we're constantly in reactive mode, reacting to stimuli, instead of creative mode, where we're sitting quietly and letting our thoughts just naturally unspool in their own organic way. So I think that 24-hour digital fast, and importantly, I used to be hopeful that like different apps could help us sort of limit our use. But now I really think to be healthy in this digital age, we really have to literally take a break from the device itself and create physical distance, leave the house without our phone on us, which is very anxiety provoking for people, right?
Yes.
But like literally go out without the device and get that physical distance from it, so that we can begin to let our dopamine reward pathways start to reset themselves, experience our attention in a new and different way, open up our sensory experience, take in more natural cues. These are all the types of things that we can try.
What do you do personally, other than going off your home? What experience have you had?
Okay, well, so I start my day with pain. I wake up around 5 a.m. when it's still dark. And as much as I want to stay in my bed, I force myself to get out of bed within about 5 minutes of waking.
Wow.
I find if I stay longer, it gets even more difficult. So those sort of heroic first 5 minutes, I get out of bed and I try to exercise. It's not super intense exercise. I do a stretching routine, or I go walking, or I go swimming. But it sets me up in a better way for the whole day, because it essentially is a way to, again, get that dopamine indirectly by paying for it up front. I try to avoid things like caffeine. I don't eat sugar. That's actually new for me. I've given up sugar recently. It was extremely difficult initially because I was eating sugar every day, multiple times a day. And I went into, sugar withdrawal, but now I'm trying not to eat sugar. And I think that's been very helpful. I own a smartphone, but I don't use it. It's mostly turned off. And I use it as a tool when I need to communicate, or use rideshare or maps or what have you. I have really been impressed by the benefit of actually powering down my device. When the device cannot transmit or receive, I personally experience a kind of quieting of my mind, knowing that the device is not in transmit mode. And I'm kind of curious if other people find this as useful. I know that my patients report it's useful. So not just, creating that distance with the device, but also just turning the device off. And then only powering it up when I need to use it for a specific purpose. For digital media, I'm very prone to wanting to watch YouTube by myself as a way to entertain and change my feelings. So I try to commit to watching no more than about 15 minutes a day, no more than a couple times a week, and preferably with other people. So these are the types of strategies that I try to use.
I know what you mean, because I used to like wine, but I'm doing like a little experiment the past 4 months. I stopped drinking alcohol, and I'm so healthy right now.
Great.
Yes, but at the same time, sometimes we kind of need that boost. When we have to give a presentation, we have to have an important meeting. I sometimes drink coffee, Red Bull. So, what's the difference between like energizing yourself and staying calm the other days? Yeah.
Well, I mean, different different drugs will have a different impact. Stimulants will, like Red Bull, caffeine, nicotine will initially sort of perk us up. Sedatives like opioids, alcohol will calm us down. But I don't think that that's the best way in the long run to either perk ourselves up or calm ourselves down, because with repeated exposure over time, again, our brains adapt. We need more and more to get the same effect. Then that drug turns on us and does the opposite of what we'd hope for. For example, I hear from lots of cannabis users that what initially helped their anxiety and sleep now makes them anxious and gives them insomnia. So what we want to look for is other ways to kind of find the psychological resilience that we need to do these tasks. It can be very hard, but I really urge people to try to not rely on substances or anything that works immediately has the possibility of being addictive.
So throughout this talk, we talked about a lot of digital dopamine. And so do you think that given the fact that there's so much technology, so much information, our human brains or mental body are not used to the modern world? Or do you think that way?
I guess we could talk a little bit about workaholism. Here in Silicon Valley, we're seeing more and more people who are, addicted to work, right? And they get all these external accolades, but at some point they lose their joy in that, right? Because the brain adapts no matter what your source of dopamine. If you overdo it, then it'll eventually stop working, and then you'll be in that compulsive loop of craving. I think it's also really important to acknowledge that work itself has become drugified and made more reinforcing, more accessible, more abundant by our devices. It feels good in the short term, but in the long term, it's not really, I think, what most of us want. So it's okay to pursue excellence in work and take pride in work, but it's so important to find that balance.
How can you tell when it's the right timing to get that balance?
PIVOT では新たなメンバーの募集を始めました。ビジネスプロデュース、エンジニア、コーポレート、映像制作など積極的に採用しています。ご応募はこちらのリンク、または概要欄の URL からお願いします。日本をピボットするコンテンツを一緒に作りましょう。